Hello everyone, it's Mimi here. BMS working in the NHS. And today's video will be about the third module of the Section 1 in the IBMS digital registration portfolio called Communication. So, just a quick introduction to this video. It will be short and sweet, I promise. It will be focused on the learning outcomes, different types of evidence, and HCPC SOPs that need to be met in this module. I will then discuss evidence justification and some ideas for evidence candidate could use in this module. I will finish this video with some helpful tips to make candidate's portfolio really good. With all that said, I hope you will enjoy the content of my video and I hope you will learn a lot. So let's dive into the third module. These are the learning outcomes candidates should be able to meet when they have completed this module. Candidates should be able to communicate the outcomes of lab investigations accurately and reliably to service users, carers, colleagues, and others. They need to be able to use information, communication, and digital technologies competently in practice. And they need to be able to demonstrate the ability to adapt their communication methods to ensure clear communication with a variety of people. When they complete this module, they should come back to the learning outcomes to see and check that they have actually met them. This is the mandatory piece of evidence. And the task is, explain the different methods you use to communicate effectively within your department and with service users. So let's break it down. The first part is asking the candidate to explain different methods they use to communicate effectively. To be able to answer that, the candidate needs to know what are the different methods of communication. They should think along the lines of verbal, nonverbal, written or visual communication. Then they need to know which methods they use in their practice effectively. They should think about active listening, using clear language, using digital tools or choosing the right medium, such as face-to-face, over the phone, email, etc. The next part is asking the candidate to specifically focus on the methods they personally use within their department. They can add to the previous part what methods they personally use specifically within their department. Candidate could consider active listening, feedback, meetings, huddles, digital tools, software or secure apps, structured documents, and so on. And the last part is asking the candidate to specifically focus on the methods they use to communicate with service users. They could elaborate on the previous part and add the methods specifically used when talking to patients or other service users. They might be the same methods, but they might be different as well. This might depend on the circumstances, whether they are communicating with another professional or a patient or a carer. Candidate could consider adjusting their tone, avoiding jargon, using clear and simple language, utilizing body language, eye contact, facial expressions, showing empathy, involving service users in decision, using visual aids, translation services, assistive technology to support communication. IBMS also offers their advice on how to approach this mandatory evidence, which I think is very good. First information is telling the candidate what type of evidence IBMS would like them to use. They could use a flow chart, table, spider diagram or an image. This depends on their personal preference. Next is advising the candidate to include different communication types in the evidence. They could consider verbal, nonverbal, written, visual, listening, interpersonal or mass communication. The next part of the advice is asking the candidate to add who they use these communication methods with. For example, what method would they use when communicating with their colleague, a doctor, another professional, a patient or a carer? They might be same, similar, or different methods of communication. Candidate could consider their approach, tone, jargon, body language and facial expressions, use of alternative formats and so on. Next part of the advice is basically telling the candidate the different communication methods, which is very helpful. They should try to mention all those methods in their evidence. And if they can, add more. Next part is asking them to include justification in form of a note or annotation to explain why and how they choose specific communication method. Candidate could consider colleagues, patients, doctors, carers, the method of communication they use with them, how they choose that method and why. The next part of the advice is asking them to explain how they know their selected method of communication is effective. They could consider the message being communicated. Has it been received and understood? Does it lead to a desirable outcome? Or is it causing issues and misunderstanding? They could consider feedback, body language and response of the recipient, outcome, verification of understanding. The next part of the advice is asking them to explain how they adapt their communication style depending on the person they are interacting with. Candidate could consider not using medical jargon when communicating with patients as they might not understand. Speaking a bit louder and slower when communicating with someone who has a difficulty hearing. Interpreters when communicating with someone who does not understand English. Using sign language or visual needs when necessary. The last part of the advice is asking them to summarize how they have improved their communication during training in response to feedback. They could think about what feedback they received and how they acted on it. How did that experience improve their communication? Have they seen any positive changes in their practice because of that? Now let's talk about the SOPs that need to be met by this piece of mandatory evidence. The first standard is, use information, communication and digital technologies appropriate to their practice. Candidate needs to be able to use appropriate information, communication and digital technologies. Is candidate using technologies in their practice? Are they selecting the correct and effective communication style? Do they provide relevant information to the service users and colleagues? What this standard is trying to find out is whether candidate can use relevant information, communication and technology available to them that is relevant to their practice. Candidates should consider appropriate information, safe, effective, secure communication, ethical, legal, confidential approach, accessible and relevant information, apply professional judgment, choose appropriately, adapt, utilize tools or AI assistance, electronic records or streamline workflow, integrating technology thoughtfully and responsibly into their practice like emails, voice messages, social media, apps and so on. The second standard is, understand the need to provide service users or people acting on their behalf with the information necessary in accessible formats to enable them to make informed decisions. Candidate needs to understand the need to provide necessary information to service users in accessible formats. Does the candidate communicate with users effectively? Do they use various forms of communication to make it effective? Do they make the information accessible? Does the information they provide enable service users to make informed decisions? Is the information they provide appropriate and necessary? Candidate could consider AIS or Accessible Information Standard in England, legal and professional duty to meet communication needs, communication method used, accessibility of the format used, for example digital, paper copy, video or voice recording, language used like no jargon, simple, clear and easy to understand, tailored to needs, empowering service users to make an informed decision about their care, inclusive, respecting their beliefs and wishes, explaining care options, risks and benefits in understandable way, support for representatives if needed, evidence-based, patient-centered care. The third standard is communicate the outcomes of biomedical procedures. Candidate needs to be able to communicate the outcomes of procedures. Is the candidate able to effectively communicate the results of tests performed in their lab? Do they use appropriate way of communication? Do they understand the results of tests performed in your lab? Are they able to effectively and accurately convey lab results and investigations to relevant people? Candidate could consider clear, actionable, secure, confidential, timely, accurate, reliable, understandable communication, methods of communication like secure electronic systems LIMS, rapid alerts for critical expected results, digital reporting, information content like patient identifiers, clinical details, findings, results, context and interpretations, best practice like authorization, transparency, audit trail, GDPR, and so on. Those are the standards candidate has to keep in mind when writing their mandatory evidence. So now that we have finished with the mandatory evidence, let's have a look at the choice evidence 2 and 3, which are candidate's choice and Q&A set by the trainer. They both together have to meet 6 HCPC standards. As the trainer, you need to set some tasks or questions for the candidate to complete that would allow them to meet the standards. If you download the module descriptors for the portfolio from the IBMS website, you will find some example evidence suggested by the IBMS, which is very handy. These are the HCPC standards that have to be met by those two pieces of choice evidence. The first standard is, understand the importance of, and obtain valid consent, which is voluntary and informed, has due regard to capacity, is proportionate to the circumstances, and is appropriately documented. Candidate needs to understand the importance of consent. Does the candidate understand the need for consent? Do they know what information needs to be included in the consent? Do they understand that the consent needs to be voluntary, have regard to capacity, be proportionate to the circumstance? Does the candidate document the consent appropriately? Candidate could consider explaining what consent is and why it is needed, importance of consent being valid, voluntary, freely given, and informed, ethical and legal requirement in healthcare to obtain consent, ethical conduct, bodily autonomy, legal protection, data privacy, capacity, safety, proportionate level of detail, voluntary, informed, documented and patient-centered care, consent shifting position of power and assumption to respect, mutual understanding and communication. The second standard is use effective and appropriate verbal and nonverbal skills to communicate with service users, carers, colleagues, and others. Candidate needs to be able to effectively communicate. Does the candidate communicate effectively? Do they use appropriate verbal and nonverbal communication skills? Are to adjust their communication style appropriately? Candidate could consider language used, active listening, clarity and simplicity, empathy, tone and volume of your voice, patience, body language, eye contact, facial expressions, gestures or personal space, carers, patients, service users, colleagues, other professionals. The third standard is communicate in English to the required standard for their profession. Candidate needs to be able to communicate in English. Can the candidate communicate effectively in English? Are they using the required level of English? If not native, can they prove they speak English? Candidate could consider English proficiency, required standard, alternative qualifications, validity, compliance, technical communication. International candidates could consider English language tests like OET Occupational English Test or IELTS, International English Language Testing System, TOEFL Test of English as a Foreign Language, which is internet-based test. The fourth standard is understand the characteristics and consequences of verbal and nonverbal communication and recognize how these can be affected by difference of any kind, including, but not limited to, protected characteristics, intersectional experiences and cultural differences. Candidate needs to be able to understand the characteristics and consequences of communication. Does the candidate understand the characteristics of communication? Can they adjust their communication to address neurodivergence, cultural difference, or intersectional experience? Candidate could consider showing their understanding of the characteristics of verbal and nonverbal communication, such as use of words, active listening, tone, pitch, clarity, consistency, body language, facial expression, intentional or non-intentional, culture-bound, differences such as neurodivergence, disability, cultural, experiential difference. Does the candidate understand the consequences of communication? Are they aware of their communication? Candidate could consider positive and negative consequences, information exchange and immediate feedback, first impressions, cues and cultural differences, trust, rapport, conflict, misinterpretation, influence, power, adjustments like inclusive practice, awareness or reflection. The fifth standard is modify their own means of communication to address the individual communication needs and preferences of service users and carers, and remove any barriers to communication where possible. Candidate needs to be able to adjust their communication to meet individual needs. Is the candidate able to adjust their communication? Are they aware of various communication needs individuals could have? Are they able to adjust their communication effectively? Can they identify communication barriers and overcome them? Candidate could consider identifying individual needs and preferences by asking, applying flexible, person-centered, empathetic and inclusive approach, using simple and clear language, patience, supportive environment, respect, active listening, appropriate body language, and facial expressions. Communication barriers like linguistic, psychological, emotional, cultural, attitude barriers, environmental barriers, strategies for removal barriers such as active listening, choosing right communication channels, using clear, simple and concise language, managing emotions, minimizing distractions, seeking feedback, nonverbal cues, communication support, utilizing interpreters or translators and so on. The sixth standard is understand the need to support the communication needs of service users and carers, such as through the use of an appropriate interpreter. Candidate needs to be able to support communication needs. Is the candidate able to support various communication needs? Do they support those needs appropriately? Are they aware of tools that can be used to support communication needs? Candidate could consider patient-centered, safe and effective care, minimizing errors, improving outcomes, holistic support, accessible information, enhancing emotional well-being, empowerment, autonomy, building trust, reducing anxiety, enabling informed decision-making. Those are the standards you have to keep in mind when you are creating questions or selecting tasks for the candidate to complete, as they all have to be met by the two pieces of choice evidence. One more thing that candidate has to include when choosing and writing their evidence, and that is the evidence justification. For the mandatory piece of evidence, the IBMS has provided a very good justification why they would want the candidate to do that piece of evidence. Ask the candidate to read IBMS justifications, as this can form the basis for how they should be justifying their choice of evidence. They should also include which specific standards were met in each evidence. These are some suggestions from the IBMS that could be used as your choice evidence in this section. They are pretty good, and can meet several standards, which is what you need and want. And these are some examples of evidence types worth considering for this section as well. Again, they can meet several standards as well, which is the goal. You could ask the candidate to complete a table you create for them. I would also like to share with you some helpful tips that can make candidates' portfolio look really good. Ask them to try and present the information in various formats such as tables, pictures, photographs, diagrams, flowcharts, graphs or even videos, if they can. This nicely breaks down a lot of text that is usually present in portfolios. Ask them to try and make it a little bit more interesting for the reader, which will be you the training officer and eventually the verifier. Ask them to try to put themselves in your shoes. How would they like to read hundreds of pages of plain text? There is a saying I really like, and it goes like this: a picture is worth 1,000 words. I will make a video where I will share my evidence I used for this module, back in the day. Hopefully that will help as well. Also ask them to try and use various types of evidence, not just one type, like case studies, for each module. They could use experiments, case studies, annotated results, annotated photographs of them performing tasks, evidence of troubleshooting, annotated EQA results, nonconformances, validation and indication evidence, comparisons of different approaches and their pros and cons, control material production, certificates of course attendance with reflective statements, annotated images or charts, and so on. Ask them to try and bring in their personality. Ask them to think about the ways they like to learn best to meet all the standards. And one more thing, ask them to keep the standards in mind when they are selecting their evidence. Good evidence will tick off several standards. And this brings me to the end of today's video. Hopefully, you now have a better understanding about the standards that are within this section and how to meet those standards with relevant evidence. And my final take-home message? Keep those standards in mind when selecting questions, tasks, and guiding the candidate. Bye for now.